Now that we're recording, I'll be able to get started. So, welcome everyone to Quality Control Publication and Updating Datasets. My name is Joshua Weinberg. I am the Legal Training Manager here at the Policy Surveillance Program at the Center for Public Health Law Research here at Temple University, Beasley School of Law. And today I'm here to talk to you about what to do to make sure your data is accurate, and then what to do once you've published and how to update it in the future. So let's get going. So today's learning objectives. Today we're going to talk about redundant coding. Redundant coding is one of the most important quality control steps in our policy surveillance process. So we need to make sure that redundant coding is done throughout the coding process. So to that end, we will learn the steps used in redundant coding, as well as talking about other statistical quality control checks that we use here at our shop. And then further after that, we'll talk about publication and getting your data out there into the world. So these are our learning objectives for today. So I always like to start off with going back to looking at the policy surveillance overview. This circle, as you've seen many times throughout this process, discusses the different steps involved in the policy surveillance process. So at this point, we've defined the scope, we've conducted our background research, we've developed our coding questions, and we've collected the law and created the legal text. So now we're in the midst of coding the law. And as you can see, it's still highlighted, but quality control is especially important during the coding the law process. In the following slides, we're going to discuss the quality control measures that we take as part of the coding the law process. Remember that quality control recurs throughout the entire policy surveillance process. So we've conducted redundant research as part of the background research process. We've written multiple memos as part of the scoping and background research process, and we've done redundant research as part of the collecting the law process. So now in coding the law, we're going to be doing our own quality control as part of it. So the first step in quality control as part of coding the law is just checking your original coding. So original coding is when a researcher initially codes a jurisdiction for a project before it is redundantly coded. So if you're thinking back to the coding the law presentation, the original coder is the one who first builds the law and then is the first one to take the questions and answer those questions using the law provided. However, as a supervisor, we want to make sure that we're conducting quality control on this original coding throughout the process. So as records are coded, the supervisor will want to check for unanswered questions. So that can be whether any questions were just not answered. Did the coder just miss them? Or was it an issue with a grandchild question, and someone didn't answer a parent question in the way that was necessary to answer a child question, and that will allow you to deal with your sort of question structure and figure out, is this question set structured the best way possible? There also might be issues with the legal text itself. We want to make sure that there's no issues with indent, spacing, additional text other than the law that will impact a coder's coding. Perhaps a researcher has notes in the original text, so we want to make sure that the original text is clean there, and therefore that our coding responses using that original text are not muddled or confused. We want the supervisor to be checking caution notes throughout this entire process. So if you remember, caution notes are the sort of flags and tags that we put on an answer choice if it's out of the ordinary, and we want to have an explanation for why we answered that question the way we did, or maybe you chose an other answer choice, meaning that the answer in the law is not an answer that was originally established as part of the coding scheme. So you want to note that this answer choice should be added. So that's when you use these caution notes. So the supervisor should check caution notes throughout to make sure that A, any answer choices that need to be added are added efficiently, and B, so that once you do publish and once you get that data out there, if anyone reads your caution notes to look at why you answered the question the way you did, it'll be clear to them as to your meaning. So, and then again, we also want to check citations. We want to make sure that the citations there is a citation for each response. This is important because we're doing evidence-based legal coding. We want to make sure there is a basis for any coding answer choice that we might make. So to do so, we use citations either in the Excel spreadsheet that you're using to code or in the Monocle software, and we want to make sure that every question is cited and that those citations are correctly written. Here we use Blue Book methodology as lawyers, but if you have a MLA or APA sort of format that you want to use for your citations, you want to check those citations throughout the coding process to make sure that the coder is following those suggestions. And then you want to check formatting issues with the legal text, as I discussed at the top. That can have to do with spacing or indents, just making sure that the text is clean and easily legible and is showing the actual text of the law that you need to show. This original coding check should occur daily as researchers are actively coding the data set and coding the records. That's opposed to redundant coding. So redundant coding is a quality control step. It'll sound similar to you if you remember our redundant research process, but the redundant coding process is when two researchers independently code identical coding records. The supervisor is then able to compare and review these records to determine where the researchers diverge. The supervisor will track and calculate this divergence rate by downloading the coding data into Excel or by using the data in the Excel spreadsheet that you're coding in. This divergence rate and all of your quality control measures should be tracked and recorded in your research protocol so that it is included in the protocol when the data set is published. And the redundant coding, the point of this is that redundant coding identifies problems with the questions, problems with the response set, and any coding errors that might occur during the coding process. So what does redundant coding look like? This is an image that explains the coding process in a nutshell. So to make assigning and reviewing redundant coding easier, we suggest that you include a coder name field in any of your data sets to identify which coder coded what response. For redundant coding to be effective, the researchers must code the records independently without speaking to the other researcher. Therefore, it is important that the system is set up in a manner where the researchers cannot see the other researchers' responses until the coding is complete. We want this to be blind redundant coding. As researchers code the same jurisdictions, they will overlap on some responses, but will likely diverge on other responses. As I just mentioned, the objective here is to identify which responses were divergent and to resolve those divergent responses. So, for example, if there are 50 jurisdictions being studied in a cross-sectional project, with batches of 10 jurisdictions at a time being assigned, the first 10 jurisdictions should all be redundantly coded. If we find that the rate of divergence for that batch has dropped below 5%, meaning that only out of all of the answer choices in those 10 jurisdictions, only 5% or less were divergent, then we can drop down to a 20% redundant coding rate. For longitudinal data sets, redundant coding must be done iteration by iteration rather than by jurisdiction. Therefore, if a longitudinal data set has 10 iterations per jurisdiction for the first 10 jurisdictions, this means that 100 iterations are available to be redundantly coded, 10 times 10. If the project requires 20% redundant coding, that means 20 iterations must be redundantly coded. But if we want 100% redundant coding, then all 100 iterations for the 10 jurisdictions must be redundantly coded. It's important to remember in longitudinal redundant coding that divergences in one iteration must be resolved for iterations that take place afterwards, because it can be assumed that if researchers diverge on a response in an earlier iteration, they are likely to diverge on the same response in a later iteration for the same jurisdiction. Meaning, if, let's say in this example, a jurisdiction has 10 records and 10 iterations, so the law has changed 10 different times during the course of our project, and in the 5th iteration, we find that there's a coding divergence, we must assume and make sure we look at the fact that iterations 6 through 10 likely have that same divergence. A longitudinal study tracks the evolution of laws over a period of time, just remember that. So we need to make sure that our redundant coding is accurately tracking those change and evolution of laws over that said period of time. And we do this by redundantly coding each iteration throughout the longitudinal coding process. So once you've assigned your redundant coding and both coders have done their coding, basically answered the same exact questions using the same exact legal text, then we are able to calculate our rate of divergence. To calculate the rate of divergence, we divide the total number of divergences in each batch of coding by the total number of coded variables. This can be done using formulas in Microsoft Excel. Once the rate of divergence is calculated, you should record it in the research protocol. The amount of redundant coding you assign in the next batch of coding depends on the rate of divergence. At the beginning of the project, as I said, the rate may be high because the coding scheme has not been sufficiently tested, and coders are new to the project and the law. But the rate of divergence should decline with each batch of coding assigned, and that's something that will be tracked in your research protocol. So you could show the improvement in your divergence rate of your coding over the course of the batches of your project. So you can show that when you first started the project in batch 1, your rate of divergence was high because all the coders were new to the process, new to the law, new to the questions. But as they got comfortable and the coding scheme is finalized, we're then able to reduce the divergence rate. And as I mentioned before, we start off with doing 100% redundant coding, and if our rate drops below 5%, if calculated as shown here, then that we could, in future batches, we can reduce our rate of redundant coding down to 20%. So here is an example of what we refer to as a coding review sheet. So this is the document where the supervisor will record all of the divergences following the calculation of the divergence rate. The coding review, as you can see, the coding review sheet document lists all the divergences in a group of records and includes the supervisor and researcher's comments on those divergences. So the supervisor should take the following steps. First, the supervisor should record every divergence. They should note which iteration that divergence is coming from, which state that divergence is coming from, and the date of that specific iteration. That is important, extra important if you are working in a longitudinal project because just the state won't identify the record at issue. The supervisor should note the question at issue, who was the coder, which researcher, and then put in a comment as to what the actual divergence is, what errors are, and any comments that they have. This document then should be passed around to the coders themselves to put notes in that resolved section about whether they, what the issue is, what they think of the divergence, why they coded the way they did. And you can see on the sheet an example of that. So we can see that in this example, EP and SJ were the coders. The supervisor noted the issues, and SJ and EP had a conversation in the comments about why they coded the way they did, whether they agree with each other, and what should change. So As part of this process, we're able to determine the reason for any divergence in the coding. There are generally two types of divergences that can occur: objective errors and interpretive errors. Objective errors are instances when the original coder and the redundant coder answered the question incorrectly. An objective error, it could be because the coder simply forgot to answer a question. It could be because of a typo. Maybe the researcher meant to code one thing but accidentally coded the other. Or it could be because the coder actually misread the law. Potentially they read the law and it just didn't click. There's also a real thing in our policy surveillance legal mapping industry is coder fatigue. At times, if a coder is coding a ton of questions over a short period of time, it is easier for these divergences, these simple objective errors, to show up. Interpretive errors, on the other hand, are errors where the coders reasonably came to a different conclusion based on different understandings of the law. This could happen if two coders define the key term differently, or if the coding scheme is not entirely well defined. So what we're going to do in that situation is resolve the divergences. And you saw that start to happen in the comment section of the coding review sheet. So when there is an objective error, the responses should be recoded. So you notice that there is a simple typo, or someone just missed an entire law or a citation. Those are objective errors that can be then fixed easily. If a researcher is making frequent objective errors, you might note that additional training may be needed for that researcher to make sure that they understand the policy surveillance process, they understand what they should be doing as part of the coding process. Additionally, in addition and differently, when there is an interpretive error, there are several potential resolutions beyond just recoding. One of those is modifying the question. If a question is unclear and is frequently causing interpretive errors or errors by coders, it is possible that the question itself or the answer choices need to be modified. The question may not be asking what we want it to be asking, so we might need to review the language. Another solution might be to collect additional law. Additional laws can be collected if they clarify an issue that is causing a divergence. When a decision has been made about how to interpret a question or responses, it should be recorded in the research protocol document. And that is also an important thing to note here, is that another thing that happens during this time is that understanding of how a question should be coded usually occurs during the coding review process. So it's possible that an interpretive error occurred because two coders were using the same legal text to answer a question differently. And that could be not because of an objective error and misunderstanding, but simply because the language in the law is not clear. The truth is that lawmakers are often not, and policymakers are often not as clear as they mean to be when they write out law. So we generally make coding rules during this time, which are rules that that can be quickly referenced during coding to know how a certain response should be coded or a certain question should be coded in a certain context. So, and that comes and is related to the last potential resolution, which is edit the response set. That maybe you realize that a answer choice needs to be further defined in the research protocol, or an answer choice needs to be added, or an answer choice needs to be edited. That can be done at this point as well. And then when editing responses to resolve an interpretive error, new responses can be added based on responses identified in the legal text, or the language used for responses can be adjusted for additional clarity. So more on resolving divergences. Researchers should work on the coding review sheet independently in the document that I showed you, and may agree or disagree on a response after revisiting the question themselves. If decisions are not able to be resolved in that, then the team can meet to discuss and resolve any outstanding divergences. What this does using the step process is that meeting does not have to be so long because you've taken that first step and resolved any obvious objective divergences that may have appeared, and you don't need to discuss them then. Following a meeting like that and following any decisions that were made that affects any jurisdictions prior or subsequent, then researchers should go back and recode and edit all of their original jurisdictions as needed. Conducting this quality control on this rolling basis as you finish each batch, so as you finish, for example, in a 50-state survey, as you finish 10 states at a time, allows early issues to be rectified before the entirety of a project's research is complete. This also serves to educate the researchers on the complexities of the project so that later research is facilitated. Initially, there should be a great deal of discussion and quality control, and as divergences are addressed, it should become faster and more efficient. Really, your first batch coding review sheet should be extra long because you have not already solidified your coding scheme at that point. So there will most likely be, as we discussed, that should be the time when all of those divergences are coming out. And as I just got a question about the coding review sheet. The coding review sheet should be independently completed by the researchers or investigators. And then you are correct, the last step here where the researchers recode all of the original jurisdictions as needed, the researchers need to go back and see how every divergence was resolved. So whether it required discussion, whether it was a supervisor noticing an objective error, whether it was just through a sort of text discussion on the document, once the coding review sheet is complete, each researcher whose states of original coding are at issue should go back, review all of the decisions, and review all of the decisions throughout. And because all of those coding decisions are going to be collected in the protocol, that's another document that we reviewed at that time. And we will then be able to, those researchers can then recode all of their original states using the rules and the decisions that were made during this coding review process. So this is the process, as I discussed, that is done. If you are doing, for example, a 5-batch project, this will be done 5 different times. So after each batch is done, you will go through and resolve these divergences. So then we include quality control at the end. So this is going to discuss our final, post-production statistical quality control. Post-production statistical quality control is the step that we take before publishing or using the data. As you can see, it looks very similar to redundant coding, except it's different in some slightly important ways. So instead of having two coders assigned to the same jurisdictions with the same questions, instead, the supervisor will randomly select unique coding instances throughout the entirety of the data set. So in an example situation, we would have 51 jurisdictions in a cross-sectional 51 jurisdiction survey, 50 states and DC. We'll randomly select unique coding instances amongst all of those records and assign a redundant coder who has worked on the project or at least has read the research protocol and understands the coding scheme to redundantly code those instances. And as you can see, that redundant coding of those random coding instances is then compared to the original final coding that you've established throughout your entire coding process to find any divergences between the final legal data and the responses coded as part of this SQC, post-production statistical quality control. We're going to discuss these steps in the next slide in more detail. So the objective here of post-production statistical quality control is to provide a population parameter estimate for the overall error rate of the project. The idea here is that it's performed once original and redundant coding is complete on the final batch, on the final everything. By testing a new round of coding against the final coding of the dataset, a reliability rate for the entire dataset can be established. We aim to guarantee 95% confidence with the overall dataset error rate. So we are looking for a 5% or below post-production statistical quality control error rate. A reliability rate of under 95%, so if you're finding an over 5% SQC rate of error, may necessitate additional statistical quality control to improve the accuracy of the data. So how is it performed? A smaller sample from the project can be selected in instances where resources are not available to redundantly code 10%, but we generally suggest a statistician to extract from the data 5 to 10% of the coding instances to assign for redundant coding. If you really want to it, obviously a larger sample size is allowed, but we are generally hoping for that 5 to 10% range and aim to meet 10% over 5%. Samples should be taken at random, but if we know that certain variables are more important or have had more divergences in the past, based on feedback with the project supervisor and coder, those variables can be weighted more heavily in the sample. A statistician can use statistical software such as Excel or Stata to create a random sample of coding instances or individual responses. So for example, a data set with 100 records and 20 potential responses therefore has 2,000 coding instances overall. So we're going to want to take 5 to 10% of those 2,000 total coding instances and assign those to those 5 to 10% of the random SQC sample to the project's researchers, and ideally ensuring that they're only coding variables that they did not originally code. So in that way, we are basically having a statistician, in summary, extract 5 to 10% of the total coding instances, so that means the total number of potential responses amongst all of the total records, assigning those random sample to researchers who have worked on the project but ideally have not done the original coding for those specific variables, and have them code. As I discussed, high-risk variables can be noted so that they are given extra weight in the random sampling. High-risk variables can include parent-level questions, which can therefore impact child questions, questions that you've identified as having complex coding schemes, or questions or responses with high divergence rates indicating a complex coding scheme throughout the redundant coding process. The statistician should meet with the project supervisor to discuss whether weighing variables makes sense for a particular data set. And so for example, if the supervisor found that certain variables were leading to high divergence rates, as discussed, those ones should be weighted extra. So doing so will ensure that tricky questions are coded accurately before the data set is published. We're then able to produce a divergence rate for the data set overall. It's done using the same methods as the redundant coding rate. The sample should be overlaid with the original data in Excel, and formulas can be used to determine the divergence rate of the data set overall. When the divergence rate is less than 5%, the data set is ready for final check. However, if the divergence rate is at or greater to 5%, the data set should be adjusted as necessary. Again, the researchers should meet to discuss any divergences. Honestly, you should probably meet to discuss any divergences if it's less than 5% as well. But if it's greater than 5%, you should then, after you've discussed those divergences, you'll need to do another round of SQC. And this will need to go on until your final SQC divergence rate is below 5%. And you'll want to record all of this in your research protocol in your quality control section. So if it only took one time, If it only took at one time, then you only need to do it once and record that once, along with the divergence rate of each iteration and the final divergence SQC rate. So in your as throughout the entire process, you are going to be calculating multiple divergence rates. So, for example, in a project where you are doing 5 batches of 10 states at a time, you're going to have a divergence rate for each batch. So batch 1 divergence rate, batch 2 divergence rate, batch 3 divergence rate, batch 4, batch 5 divergence rate that you're going to record in your protocol. And then you are going to have an SQC divergence rate that captures the divergence rate of your final post-production statistical quality control process throughout for the entire project. So in that situation, you'll have at least six divergence rates in your research protocol. You potentially have more if you're finding that your final SQC divergence rate is at 5% or more, and you'll need to do more SQC to get that below 5%. All of this, again, is recorded in your research protocol so that your process is clear and replicable. So you've gotten your divergence rate below 5%. The data is ready. We're going to perform a final quality control check. So this is at the end of the data set, the supervisor should go through, remove any redundant or SQC coding records for before publication. We want to review all caution notes and to make sure that there are any that there are no unforeseen situations that will affect publications, such as missing responses, etc. And here we have a handy list of the things that you should check at this time. So the final quality control checks include making sure to check for any questions that were not answered, any missing citations that you might have, any outlier responses, and any inconsistent caution notes. The supervisor should go through and remove all of these, move any questions that haven't been answered, any outlier responses. And additionally, in a longitudinal data set, you will want to make sure that there are no time gaps, meaning that there are no gaps in time between the records in a jurisdiction. So if you have 5 records in a date range for jurisdiction, make sure that there is no gaps in time. So in summary, redundant coding consists of 2 researchers independently coding identical coding records, and statistical quality control provides a population parameter estimate for the overall error rate. Do you have any questions about that? If not, I will bring up, we have a separate presentation about updating the law. So let me grab that real quick. If you have any questions, please let me know at this time. Otherwise, we're going to move on to tracking and updating the law. So what to do once you've published, once you've done all of these things. Give me 1 second. Let me switch over. Tracking and updating the law. The date's wrong in there. It's November now, but same idea. Does everyone see that? Let me know if you do not. All right, great. Tracking and updating the law. So tracking and updating the law, these are the learning objectives for the rest of our day today. We want to learn the steps to track and update the law. Tracking and updating the law. Once your data set is finished, it can easily be updated using the policy surveillance process. So this is a situation where you have done everything we discussed in all of the previous presentations. You've gone through the entire policy surveillance process. You've published. You've, oh, you do not see the screen. Let me try this again. Sorry about that. Great. Do you see it now? All right. So tracking and updating the law, once your data set is finished, it can be easily updated using the policy surveillance process. Basically, this is a situation that's perfect if you have a cross-sectional project that you want to turn into a longitudinal project, for example, or if you have a longitudinal project and you want to continue it. Here at our shop, it depends on the project. We do yearly updates for some, we do quarterly updates for others. Other projects we unfortunately never go around to updating. But if you do want to update it, let's discuss. So passive updates is the first type of update. So this is when you passively track the issues related to your data set. So you want to use alerts to get updates for a data set as new laws and policies are enacted or amended. And the good use for that is Google Alerts or alerts on a legal search engine that will allow you to, that will inform your team of when an update has occurred. As well as updating impacted jurisdictions when there's been a change to the law. So by passive updates, what we're referring to are updates that you maybe don't have planned. You don't have a full policy surveillance process in mind to capture every single update, but you know that a certain state has updated this, so we're just going to update it as we go along. This is as opposed to an active update, which is sort of more planned. So this is when you have to periodically review a data set to fully update the data. You want to review every citation to relevant laws for amendments since this is the last update. And to do so, we're going to jump back into our project's research protocol where we've hopefully identified all of our search terms to identify new laws and policies that have been enacted since the last update. So this is where keeping a really good research protocol comes in handy, because it could have been a year since you last worked on this project, and you might not remember all of your search strategies. You might have different researchers or different investigators working on the project than did originally. So, and an active update where you're going to need to check every jurisdiction for a potential update is important. So, the steps in tracking and updating the law. As you'll note, they're relatively similar to the steps in policy surveillance generally. So we're going to go through all of these steps briefly now, the rest of this presentation. So first, we're going to search for updates. We want researchers to re-familiarize themselves or to familiarize themselves generally with the project. Again, oftentimes updates are happening a while after the project was last finished. So we want to review the project's coding questions, we want to review the project's background memorandums, and we want to read the research protocol, which includes information on, hopefully, the scope of the data set, the search terms that will be used to conduct the research, and the definitions of terms of art of the data set. Doing so will help us re-familiarize ourselves with the project so that we can move forward without any time wasted. So the next thing we're going to want to do is verify which jurisdictions have been in legislative session since the last update. So if we know that there have not been any legislative sessions since the last update, then we know that our search strategy will be impacted by that. So we want to check for new laws in jurisdiction that have had a legislative session since the last update, because most likely if they did change anything, it would have been during that legislative session. So we're able to use that as a hint to whether we need to search for updates or not. In addition, we will use the citations listed on our master sheets. What's great about keeping your master sheets from your original research is that we already have a handy list of all of the jurisdiction, all of the statutes citations, regulations, whatever in a jurisdiction at issue, we already have that list, and we're going to be able to to simply look for those relevant laws and look for any updates to those laws on our master sheet, which you should already have. Using that list, we want to verify whether the laws listed on the master sheet for each jurisdiction have had a recent amendment and update these master sheets accordingly. If you have a cross-sectional master sheet, then you're able to now add under each section, as you can see where that effective date and statutory history, add more statutory history, add the changes that have happened. You do this by entering each citation into any legal search engine or Google or whatever you're using to search for updates. And when that law has an amendment, add that amendment to the master sheet and note all of that. We also want to use the search terms recorded on the research protocol to find any relevant laws that have been enacted since the last update. If we only rely on the laws that we've already collected in our master sheets, then we're going to miss any new laws that may have occurred. So this search, again, can be done in any legal search engine using the search strategy in terms we've established already. And you also might want to go back and check the table of contents of the area of law you're working in, or an important note is if a law that you've already collected has been amended, you can go and look at that actual bill or amendment and see if there are other sections of law that were added or other amended at the same time. So we want to then collect the law, as you said, once we've searched for updates. We're now ready to collect the law. So this is the same process as before. Using an unencumbered source, we want to collect these new laws or any updates to laws. When a new law is amended, enacted, or an amendment is enacted, it must be collected from the unencumbered source. The unencumbered source, remember, can include state legislative websites. But basically, we want to make sure we're not using copyrighted legal text here. We then want to create the legal text. Again, the legal text, a lot of this is going to be a review of stuff we talked about in prior presentations, but the legal text is the organized version of the relevant law for a jurisdiction. Longitudinal projects, which most likely if you're doing an update, we would suggest turning your cross-sectional project longitudinal instead of just replacing your existing cross-sectional data. You want to have multiple legal texts for one jurisdiction over a period of time. So if you have a jurisdiction that did enact a new law or an amendment, you'll now have a new legal text capturing that change. We then use that, and you will then follow the longitudinal process of building and coding to use that legal text to code the law. We then want to create the legal text. As I mentioned, three types of documents are used. You've already updated your master sheet. And then sorry, I don't know why I keep jumping ahead. We are going to be using our master sheet to create an amendment tracker. If you already have an amendment tracker, you can just update that one. But if you're going from cross-sectional to longitudinal, we're going to discuss how to use an amendment tracker and master sheet to create the legal text briefly here. And then the other document you want is your legal text, i.e. the individual law at issue. So amendment tracker, remember, an amendment tracker is a document that lists amendments to relevant laws in one jurisdiction in chronological order. It's created as a guide for when creating a policy surveillance project or updating a legal assessment project. So basically, as you can see in this example here, if we had a cross-sectional project that was at the time showing the laws of January 1st, 2011, then this would show an example of what happened when we updated it. We found that on May 11, 2012, all of these laws were amended, and so we create a amendment tracker capturing those changes and amendments to the law as they changed on May 11, 2012. And as you can see, this example has a third iteration where the law then changed July 1st, 2012. So this is an example of an amendment tracker, and this is how the master sheet, the amendment tracker, and the legal text works together for a longitudinal project. So as you can see, in your master sheet, you've now updated your master sheet based on your
updated research and found that there was an amendment to the law. For example, in this one, effective May 11, 2012, that was an update. So you recorded that in your master sheet. That then goes in your amendment tracker in iteration 2 because it is the first change since your original iteration 1. We're also going to capture the amendment details and what changed. Then we are then able to use that amendment tracker to create a new full legal text for iteration 2 for May 11, 2012. So now we're going to have a legal text for our July 1st, 2011, or whatever our iteration 1 was, and now we have a legal text for iteration 2. So it's the same process we talked about in the earlier presentations, but here it applies. Basically, if you have a cross-sectional project already and you're updating it, you're turning it into a longitudinal project. So at this stage in the process, you're creating your legal text. You've checked for updates and have fully built the legal text for each iteration that will then be used to answer the coding questions to show how the law has evolved over time. So here's an example of the full legal text for May 11, 2012. Which will then allow us to code these new iterations. So again, we want to remember that we don't want to override our previous coding for a cross-sectional project. We want to code new iterations to show how the law has changed over the course of time. So in brief, coding the law again consists of using the legal text you've collected to answer the questions you've developed. So we develop questions, we collect the laws, and then we code answers to the questions based on the laws collected. Those modules there are in reference to the modules on our learning library at lawatlas.org. If you need a refresher on any of those steps, please go visit. And then we code our new iteration. So you've seen this example before. It's basically what we talked about in coding the law. But here this would be potentially a new iteration where a new behavior was added. And we can see here, this is an example of how coding works for new iterations. So in iteration 1, in our original iteration that we had collected the law as of October 27, 2013. And we noted that the penalty for a violation at that time was $100. On October 28, 2013, the penalty was changed. Instead of just being $100, it was reduced to $50 to $100, so our coding in the new iteration has changed. And we didn't override the previous iteration. We have created a new iteration that allows us to show how the penalty has changed over time. So basically, this is what we end up with. We end up with multiple iterations coded, capturing those updated laws that we're finding in the course of the update. Note, updating the valid through date. When updating a jurisdiction, the latest coding iteration should indicate when the laws were researched so the team knows the date that these laws are guaranteed to be valid through. This should be done even when a jurisdiction has no amendments or new laws that have been enacted. It indicates that the law has been checked for updates up to that point in time. So going back to here, if our new through date of the project is January 1st, 2016, and this record, for example, in New York, we showed that there was a change, but if there was a situation where there wasn't a change, we would then change the through date of iteration 1 to January 1st, 2016 to show that there was no change over the course of that time. So that the end date of our project, of all of our iterations, well, not the end date for each of our jurisdictions eventually, depending on the iteration, will be the same in each jurisdiction so that all of our data will line up. And then we do our same quality control that we did previously, that we just discussed in the first half of today's presentation. We want to do redundant research on our updates. We want to do redundant coding on our updated coding, and we want to do a final quality control check on our final coding and our final data from the update. Again, with quality control, this is going to be repetitive from what we talked about earlier today. When assigning redundant coding in an update, the first 5 iterations to receive an update are 100% redundantly coded, but then we generally go down to 20% of any subsequent records to be redundantly coded. This is because we are working with updated information and previous coding
it is likely that all the divergence rate will be below 20%. The updated iterations is compared with the coding of the last iteration for each jurisdiction to ensure that the coding in the update is consistent with the original coding. So here, this is just pointing out that we don't need to do full redundant coding on each of the updated iterations. We can compare it to previous coding that we've already quality control checked in our original publication. So then we update our publication documents. When republishing a project, we want to update any ancillary publication documents, such as the data file, such as the research protocol, such as the code book. If we need to add any answer choices, we're going to need to update the code book, etc. If we change our coding scheme or at all, we want to update that as well in our research protocol. And then finally, we want to republish the project. You might have already published the project somewhere, whether it be on our website, laws.org. If you, again, or for the first time, if you have a project that you want to publish on our website, we are happy to accommodate. All you need to do is meet our policy surveillance standards, and we'll help you meet those, and we can publish online using our plugin, map tool. Or if you have your own organization website or wherever you publish, you'll want to republish on whatever dissemination outlet was initially used to publish your project. So, in summary, the steps for updating the law include searching for updates, collecting the law, creating a legal text, coding new iterations, conducting quality control, updating the publication documents, and republishing the project. In a nutshell, it is the entirety of the policy surveillance process. So, if you have any questions about anything in the policy surveillance process, if you have any questions about quality control measures that we discussed in the first half, in publication, which we touched on briefly, or in updating and republication, feel free to ask now. Feel free to be in touch with us, tweet at us, visit our website, send me an email. We want to help you get the most out of your policy surveillance projects. If you are interested in conducting your own policy surveillance projects, we can assist with that. And otherwise, yeah, if you have any questions, now is the time to ask, or otherwise, please email me, call me. And again, if you have anyone else who is interested in going through these same webinars or a similar webinar, we always are updating these, so it's possible that the examples will be updated, etc. For the spring, we're doing a similar spring schedule. So visit our website for more details. Registration is now open, I believe. And if you wanted to do this in person, we have our Summer Institute the first week of June, where we will be talking about all of this in much more detail, along with technical assistance on your own projects. So otherwise, have a great rest of your Tuesday. And again, let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.